Hi everybody, welcome to today's episode of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. And today's is another one that I think Rich affectionately titled a fill-in. I'm not sure if I'm still on board with that or not.
The fill-ins, no, you got to embrace it, Phil. That's what these episodes are.
But because it is one of those episodes, I'm joined both by Rich. So welcome, Rich.
Hi, Phil.
And also my partner at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. Kelly, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, guys. And big piece of advice, if there's anything that you want to pull off and you're not sure Phil is going to agree, the best strategy is to just go ahead and do it. Because once it's out there, he won't make you pull it back. That was the secret on the fill-ins.
No, but we do have the power of the edit button.
I suppose we do, yeah. But we try to use it judiciously. Yeah, we want to be real with our listeners here.
So today's episode is really both a look back at the last couple of conversations that we have had and also look forward to what's coming next. And when I look on the conversations we've just had, we have spoken with Martin Chilcott, the founder of Manufacture 2030, and also Paul Polizzotto, who's the founder of Community AI. Two different conversations. We talked a lot with Martin around carbon and kind of the role that procurement can play in carbon emissions. We talked with Paul about social impact and the role that we can play there. So let's start with Martin. And if I just ask you, Rich, kind of what were some of your takeaways from that conversation?
Well, obviously, Martin spoke brilliantly and eloquently on the topic of procurement's role in decarbonization and how, and if we think up to the most macro themes that we're talking about in this podcast, it's the subhead of the title, to purposeful procurement. Martin said he believes that corporate procurement can be the heroes of the story of global warming and bending climate change for the better over time. And isn't that a grand ambition for this profession? And I think the thread that connects these last couple of episodes and the conversation that we'll have today in a portion of this fill-ins episode is we're touching on other forms of value creation that procurement already plays some role in advancing throughout the corporate world. And yet they play that role not because of their incentive structures, but despite them. It's there's nothing about the systems of measurement that they tend to operate under that asks them to do these things, whether it's work in decarbonization, community and social impact work. And yet, if they were asked, it's almost like these episodes remind us of what's possible if the incentive structures did, in fact, ask procurement to do these things. And so as we start approaching the portion of this season where we're going to think about the future plan and what we might publish at the end of this season, where we try to hand procurement leadership with a better set of incentives that might promote optimal outcomes, it should, of course, incorporate all these other forms of value creation. And so I want to pick that back up in a moment, but I don't want to let the Martin Chilcott episode thread extinguish quite yet here, because there was another thing that Martin said that to me was one of the big answers that we've gotten throughout this whole journey so far. I genuinely approached this season pretty confident that the flaws in the system that we've talked about actively do harm to the P&L, and that procurement plays a role in practice that is less ownership-minded than it should be, less aligned with the P&L than it should be, because of the systems we've discussed. But I really was curious. I was wondering if some of these very same flaws in the system stood in the way of decarbonization work and were a hindrance to energy efficiency investment, to more sustainable business. And Martin was definitive on this topic, that absolutely yes, the harms extend beyond the P&L and are actually hindering progress in something as massively important as global decarbonization and the impact that the corporate world makes on climate. And so, to me, that was a big moment in this whole process. There were numerous other brilliant insights that Martin shared, but that was my big takeaway. How about you?
So the takeaway for me was, we've spent some of this journey so far, and I'm sure we'll spend some of the journey into the future talking about savings and cost, and the difficulty that being measured on savings alone brings to all the different value drivers that we can bring. One of the interesting points that Martin talked about was, this is again in the context of emissions and carbon, is that thinking about a total cost of ownership model, what are some of the costs, and that there is actually a cost of emissions, and that is something that can be built into a total cost of ownership model. As we start to, kind of encourage you to look at total cost versus just piece price of something, what costs can also be saved. And so reducing emissions on the other side of the ledger therefore has a cost saving associated with it, as can other things that kind of are built up into that TCO, that total cost of ownership model. So I just think that's something to keep in mind as we think about, it's not necessarily that cost and savings is that we're trying to say that doesn't matter, but maybe we should be broadening our view of what cost actually means and what costs go into, ultimately the purchase and use of something.
Well, vastly more things impact cost than just unit prices,
right?
That go in a contract. There's a line that Dan Kreitz on my team says to me that I've referenced in this podcast that is there's no line item in the general ledger for savings. It doesn't exist in the general ledger. There's just costs, and the costs are what they are. And so if a certain factor, like for example global warming, impacts a company's costs because, as Martin alluded to, the price of cocoa has gone up 400% because there's fewer and fewer places where you can actually grow it, then of course that's a cost. That's real. And if you could change that reality, that would be a savings. If you could drive the price down because you changed the conditions that enabled a better supply, that would also be a savings. And so the future state should find ways to incorporate all the other things that procurement does that drive real value into the systems of measurement. I mean, that's got to be the healthier future state.
Now, a question for you, Kelly. Part of the conversation with Martin as well, we talked about kind of the 12-month problem of the snapshot of time under which we attribute success or failure to an initiative as an example, and how, if we're taking a longer time horizon, 36 months, for example, that may put a very different spin on how we determine what success looks like and how we are measured for the success that we drive. But my challenge with that is that, we're so conditioned to work in 12-month cycles or even quarterly cycles. Is that really ever a reality?
Well, and if it is a reality, how does it make everybody feel? So in my practitioner days, I was part of a grocery resale, not for resale procurement team. And depending on what category you were in, right? So I was hired services. We've talked about that a lot. It's consumable, at least in the service standpoint. There were also things like plastic containers for the deli or plastic bags for produce. Very consumable. Again, you'd be working on a single financial year from a savings perspective. But then when you started to look at capital expenditures, when you started to look at construction, what they would actually do is take the savings from any given sourcing project or contract that was signed and spread it out on the same timeline as that asset would be depreciated over. There is nothing more depressing than putting a ton of work into a massive construction project and saving millions of dollars, and then seeing how tiny that number gets when you spread it out over a 30-year depreciation schedule. So it's not even necessarily solving the problem we've been talking about to look beyond the 12-month cycle, because the numbers get really small really fast when you start tethering to something beyond 12 months. At the same time, there has to be middle ground. We can't just always think, well, first year of this contract, we're going to save X, right? We also don't want to be looking out over 30 years because the chance that you're even still going to work at the company at that point is so slim. But there has to be a workable middle road where maybe we know our best measurements are going to be short term because that's where we have the most specificity around at least demand. But at the same time, not pretending the future doesn't exist when it comes to allowing that bigger picture to influence the actual decisions being made.
Yeah, and what that 12-month period does do is it drives it incentivizes us to take decisions that may not be in the best interest of the business. So, preloading our savings, getting a rebate up front, but we're paying for it later. Negotiating a deal where you're going to get annual year-over-year savings of, let's say, 3%. So you could actually take 10% now, but you're going to take 3% year-over-year because you can show every year another 3% reduction. So I do think this is something that we have to look at, is the time period of measurement.
I agree, and yet let's not lose sight of the really big considerations. When we asked Martin the question of if year-over-year became half-decade over half-decade, or even 3-year over 3-year period, and the question was, what impact would that have on the pace of global decarbonization investment? And he said it would be massive, a massive impact. And so I have to pause right there and say, okay, this is a change that has to be made. And I've got the simple and easy solution. Since everybody is so wired to think of everything through a year-over-year prism, all we have to do is collectively agree that a year is now 1,095 days. In other words, 3 times 365. It's no longer one trip around the sun. Now it's 3. Okay, 3 trips around the sun is a year. And if we can keep measuring everything year over year, since we all just insist there's something magical about that increment of time, we have to do it. But let's just agree a year is 1,095 days. And I think we might save not only the P&L but the world if we did it.
Now transition.
Are you with? Who's coming with me?
Yeah. It'd mean a few less birthdays, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. I think I'd be like 17. Right. It's perfect.
I want to transition to Paul Polizzotto's conversation where we talked about social impact, and I think that social impact can mean different things to different organizations, and we can talk a little bit in a minute about what those could look like. But it's important to introduce this as a topic of an area of value creation that procurement can drive. And I think one of the important things to come out of that conversation, and I'm not sure if Paul said it or I paraphrased it as I was kind of writing afterwards, was it's so important that these initiatives are not philanthropic, that they are ROI generated. And that was a big focus on the work that he does. But absolutely, as we're thinking about social impact, there has to be business reasons to do this. But you find business reasons to do it. You find good ROI. They can be another powerful kind of value drive that procurement can bring.
Yeah, Paul. Yeah, he did business, not philanthropy, and it does pass my smell test when Paul argues that that social impact dollars are more effective just from a sales and marketing and advertising perspective than a very high percentage of any given company's sales and marketing and advertising budget. That, and he acknowledged even that field itself, the industry itself has the old saying, I know I waste half my advertising budget, I just don't know which half. And so the industry itself acknowledges that that there's tremendous amount of waste in all that, and I'm sure that it's true of my marketing budget too. We whether it's our email campaigns or the work we're doing, that all kind of goes into burnishing our image publicly. It is hard to always know what impact you're having, and yet Paul will tell you that the social impact dollar, it's not nearly so hard. It's like, first of all, there's this thing you did for your community, and there's a beneficiary there. I harken back to the Kate Vitasic conversation we had, where it was like buyers and sellers working more as neighbors, and in a less transactional, more relational fashion because they're doing this good thing together. But the amplification, as Paul described, the PR and marketing benefits that come with the social impact investment also has, tangible value in much the same way that a commercial, a TV ad, could have. This is all part of burnishing a company's image, and probably in a way that might very well be more effective on a dollar for dollar basis than many other dollars that get spent in sales, marketing, and advertising.
And when I think about social impact, I think about initiatives as well. Like a long time ago, we were talking about this off mic. I interviewed the chief supply chain officer for Kaiser Permanente. Mm-hmm. There are social impact programs around local sourcing and impact sourcing, and kind of where are you putting your money? Are you putting your money in local communities? investing and giving back into local communities. Again, not from the benefit of your heart, but because it's a good business decision to do that, because you're putting more money in the hands of people who are your customers or who you want to become your customers. Another area, and Kelly, I know that you've done a lot of work in this area that is, I think about in that social impact category, is around modern slavery. And, looking at what can we do from a procurement organization to really address modern slavery in our supply chains.
And that's everything from where do raw materials get sourced, how do they get processed, to the actual freight associated with moving those goods to market. I mean, it's an unfortunate consequence of our amazing modern supply chains that they are so good and so effective that they end up creating sort of the perfect channel for moving adults, moving children off the system, as is one way of thinking about it, through modern slavery. And because so many of our supply chains today are 8, 10, even 12 tiers deep, it's incredibly hard to have visibility into what's going on at every single one of those layers. And that's another one of those perfect examples, not local community impact, right? But if you think about caring about the big picture, if you're thinking of humanity on the same scale as something like impact to climate, that certainly very quickly brings you around to modern slavery.
Yeah, I think the tie that binds here these last two conversations is, if we are going to try to build a set of guidelines that would promote procurement with purpose, then of course this is the kind of thing that you would want to find some way to account for. It can't be just occasion. We're going to have a handful of team members that really are on a mission, to also do some good. But all we really ask them to do is hit this savings target. No, we need to hand the entire enterprise a set of ambitions that says, here's what we're about. Now go pursue all of these things, and we find a way to blend them together and measure it. And so maybe it's at this juncture that I want to ask you, Kelly and Phil. We touched on, because we all acknowledge, like forever and a day, procurement's been measured not even on cost, on savings as this construct that is defined in the way it is in all the the flawed ways that it is defined. We've covered that ad nauseum, but it has not included things like decarbonization. Typically, has not included community and social impact. Typically. But okay, we named three there. There's P&L impact, there's economic, or there's decarbonization, there's social impact. But we know that procurement practitioners day in, day out drive value in even other forms. That's not an exhaustive list yet. What else needs to go on this list? Phil, I'll start with you and then let's throw it to Kelly. What else belongs on the list of forms of value creation that have real, and when I say real value, I mean monetary value to the business? What else is procurement doing that's absent from today's system but should be present in the future one?
I think one of the things that comes to mind is, and this is it's more towards the revenue side. And it's funny, talking about this goes in cycles based on kind of the business cycle. And we haven't talked about this as a profession very much for a long time, and that's supplier-enabled innovation. So the innovation the collective R&D capability of your supply base is many, 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 many times more than you as an organization, even if you're one of the largest R&D or the largest R&D organization in the world can ever bring to bear. And so that capability exists within your supply base, which then is really tied to how can we tap into the R&D capability of our supply base to drive revenue. And it feels like 10 years ago when I started out of procurement, we were talking about supplier-enabled innovation as being really important. It's almost like it's on this cycle of when business is good and we're not so worried about the expenses, now let's talk about innovation.
Yeah.
But then what we do is when the business cycle changes, all those concessions we gave to help enable innovation to be a customer of choice go out the window with the first letter that says, I want 5% cost reduction because, I need money.
Yeah.
And we put ourselves back again because it damages all the trust. So being able to think about enabling innovation, using suppliers to enable innovation, it can be an innovation in product, but it can also be innovation in business model design, which comes more to services than it does to, manufactured components. But building that in, so it's a long-term value driver, a value measure for procurement, and it doesn't just kind of go up and down with the business cycles, because really, then it becomes, we do so much damage when we drop that as something we don't care about anymore. But there's so much innovation to come from our supply base.
Such a great answer. Supplier innovation. Put it on the list. Kelly, what else?
So I would actually say close, but not quite the same, supplier diversification. I don't care how many steps are on your strategic sourcing chart, 6, 8, 10. Step 1 is always go see how much money you were spending with who on this thing or service in the past. Step 2 is go find out who could do the same or could meet the same business need in a slightly different way. Procurement is always doing that, but it's so incredibly frustrating because in almost all cases, we don't get to decide who gets the business in the end. And so we're constantly going out and needing to understand what is the true business need behind this product or service. We're not just going out with spec, finding other suppliers, pre-qualifying them, coaching them into and through the sourcing process, maybe getting them through negotiation. And then in almost every single case, they don't get the business, not even a piece of it. Yeah. And I think that's incredibly frustrating in a couple of ways, because there are opportunities to bring different either suppliers or ways of meeting business needs into the organization. But then all of that knowledge that procurement builds up in the process of boiling down, discovering, pre-qualifying these other providers just goes nowhere when the sourcing project is over. And I think that in and of itself is an additional form of lost value, lost opportunity, and it's based on work that procurement is already doing anyway.
Yeah, I think about that as it's a very good kind of risk mitigation strategy as well. When you think about a lot of monopolies, we just about brushed on this in the Martin conversation, but where you identify monopolies in your within your supply chain, where you need to be developing alternative sources of supply. That can be something that we can identify. Here's the 10 suppliers that we're really vulnerable with.
Yeah.
What are the efforts? Like, is a value driver, is a metric for us that we have now got 2 suppliers options in that space, or 3 suppliers because we've developed those suppliers.
Let's put a pin in that monopoly conversation because I do want to come back to that. But I've got supplier innovation, I've got supplier diversification, I've got risk mitigation.
So I'm going to ask you, when you think about some of the most creative deals that your team has worked on at Fine-Tune, has there been any, areas of value that have gone beyond, that we were able to reduce the cost?
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's in a million ways, and of course we do have an incentive structure that asks us to do that because what we are incentivized by is delighting our clients. Mm-hmm. And so we know there are a million ways to delight our clients. And so, of course, our deals tend to revolve around spend reduction, but it's also program improvement in a million ways, quality improvement.
Yeah.
And, if it's a security program, making our clients more secure. If it's a pest control program, preparing our clients to perform better in food safety audits. And so, quality, I think, is a huge one. I think satisfaction with supplier, it's just supplier stakeholder satisfaction is another huge one. I would say, I think now this is a little bit outside the fine-tune experience, but as I try to answer the procurement question in general, I think also of speed and agility. I think of a shrewd procurement practitioner is finding solutions that help a business become more agile and efficient. Do you think I'm on the right track as the procurement lifer here?
Yeah, I think that's another. When I think about speed and agility, speed can be how fast is it to do a deal.
Yeah.
But agility can be how easy is it for me to move away from suppliers if I need to, or to add another supplier to the mix quickly if I need to. So that's really a risk mitigation strategy, but it's something that in these days, I remember a conversation a long time ago with the chief risk officer. I think she worked for Land O'Lakes at the time, a lady called Susan Grelling. And she was just always talking about optionality. Like, how can you build optionality into your supplier deals, into your category strategies, so you're just not stuck now forever or for the next 3 years or till the next contract is signed with the thing that you've signed.
Phil, this is you just reminded me of another great answer to your last question, which is, and this goes right in the risk mitigation realm. I have noticed over the last 10, 15 years or so a scourge of large companies, especially large companies, being trapped with their incumbent suppliers because they have, and this goes right into the systems of incentive that they've been handed. They have paid little to no mind to their end of contract liabilities. And so all the attention was focused on short-term savings. Here we are with Kate Vitasic. Short-termism, again, has won the day. And so they've focused all their attention there, and they come towards the end of the deal and they realize, oh, well, if we want to switch, there's a $5 million weight hanging around our neck here, and even if there was $3 million in savings out there with supplier Y, it wouldn't make any sense to switch because we're stuck. So I mean, another way that we help our clients mitigate risks is I often have this conversation with clients where I say, look, as of today, you're really not a free agent in the marketplace. So we need to think of this as like a 2-contract strategy. We're going to save a little here in the first contract, but we're going to make you a free agent so you can really capitalize next time around. These are the hard conversations we often have to have with our clients because they have failed to mitigate their risks.
And actually, demonstrating your ability to change just a little bit of a contract with a provider gives you so much more leverage the next time as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so true. So, I think we've built a nice little list there, and this will be a continuing kind of workshop exercise. Kelly, is there anything we haven't hit on yet before we close the door on this particular sub-thread that you think belongs on this list of other forms of value creation?
This is the point where everybody listening in or watching the video is yelling some other form
of
value at the screen, at the computer. But I think at least what we've talked about demonstrates sort of the range of categories of value that can be associated with procurement well above and beyond cost and savings.
Absolutely, yeah. And we want to hear from the community. So when this episode runs, please comment on LinkedIn and tell us where our blind spots are. We want to know.
And where we're going next is we're going to speak with the executives at a big company and a small company, because we've talked in the last couple of episodes about carbon emissions and social impact. Of course, value drivers beyond savings are not just related, as we've just talked in the last 10 minutes or so, to those initiatives at all. What we want to do is we wanted to start going and saying, okay, let's go ground level and let's kind of listen to ways that companies of different sizes have been able to think about breaking the mold in terms of their incentive structure. Now, what I say that on a large company, it's, abandoning the word savings, and we're going to be talking about that in what I believe is the next episode. The one after that is somebody who's in a much, much, much smaller organization, and the way that they work is really tied to the way they need to work because of the environment they're in. But there's lots of things that we can pick up in terms of how we can kind of take what's working in that environment and build it into a incentive structure that works for companies of all sizes. And what we're trying to achieve kind of as we make this next pivot is that the tactics and the strategies you can use, the metrics that you can use, the incentive structures you can use are not the domain of, well, I work in a big company or I work in a small company and that's just what they do in big companies, or vice versa.
Yeah.
There's so much that's transferable between companies of all sizes.
Yes, and we're at the point of the story where it's time for us to start turning our attention to solutions.
Yeah.
And so we identified problems that I think we've really clearly and obviously, made the case exist, are substantial and are growing. And so now it's time for us to start trying to envision solutions. And I'm really excited. And I do think these next 2 episodes are going to be so complementary. You've got, Thomas Ideson is a first of all, he's an inspirational leader and known voice in the world of corporate procurement alone. But if you intersect the worlds of corporate procurement and corporate sustainability, he's at the absolute pinnacle of global thought leadership and just leadership in this space. And so that's going to be a fascinating episode. I'm really, really excited to talk to Thomas, but to come back with Christine Morton right after Thomas, it will just be such an interesting comparison of somebody who has worked in mostly small to mid-sized environments, family-owned, private equity-backed, franchise-owned communities, and it's just going to be a really interesting complement. I think these 2 episodes should provide a great contrast, and yet also common threads between the two, and they'll kind of send us off into the solutions focused portion of this this season long journey.
Yeah, the conversation with Thomas at such a big company like Bayer, procurement exists because there are lots of structural reasons why procurement has to exist from a regulatory perspective, for example. Then you look at the organization that Christine works for. Christine has to has to fight for the right to be able to support the organizations that she supports with procurement. So it's just two very different kind of coming to it perspectives, but interestingly similar ways and similar ways they think about connecting with their stakeholders. So that's
Kelly, what excites you about these upcoming episodes?
Well, I certainly think both sort of the big company perspective, Thomas, as you said, is excellent, but in prepping Christine, right, as we start to talk about small company situation, I actually think in a situation like that is when you really see procurement shine, right? In a small organization, you're less likely to have hard and fast mandates. You're more likely to have distributed decision-making, which by definition takes down how much you consolidate your spend. I actually think some of the small to medium-sized procurement team leads are in fact some of the most innovative procurement leaders out there because they're being dealt with that much more challenging of a situation. And yet, as we've talked about, still the same metrics, still the same supply challenges, still with the same supplier management objectives. I think they have to get a little bit more creative to deliver in a different framework, but along the same lines.
Yeah, totally agree. We're going to wrap up here in a moment, but before we do, I want to really quickly just circle back to the pin we dropped earlier, because along the way throughout this process, we occasionally, it's like it put this comment in the category of other stuff that was kind of unexpected that came up along the way. And there's a thread that has now arisen a couple of times throughout this process on monopoly, antitrust, anti-competition, and how it intersects with corporate procurement. And I think this is a very interesting thread that we won't have enough time to really explore thoroughly in this, single season of By the Way. But I wonder if the listeners would have interest in talking about it in a potential future project, because I really think there's a fascinating story here that actually explores some of the themes we're talking about. The question I want to pose is, have the flaws in the system that we've been talking about and the way that they allow corporate procurement often to not have to engage in the joust over the actual money exchanging hands and instead focus on this separate calculation that exists outside the P&L, have those very same flaws also starved the anti-monopoly movement, if you will, of a natural ally? That, should corporate procurement be a louder voice than it is on monopolies and antitrust? Because we've lived through, all of us have lived through multiple decades of rampant corporate consolidation of power in one industry after another. If there used to be 6 options, today there are 2 or 3. And this works against buyers, you would think. And yet I have to admit, in my time working with corporate procurement, I don't meet a lot of anti-monopoly crusaders, and yet our project got the attention of one. There's a guy named Matt Stoller at the American Economic Liberties Project. It's a DC-based anti-monopoly advocacy group who took an interest in our project. He was listening, and he said, "Wow, this is good." And he asked the question. He said, "Where's procurement on antitrust? Why aren't they my allies? And I wonder if some of the stuff we're talking about is the answer, to that question. I find it interesting. I don't know altogether what I think yet, but it's Martin Chilcott brought it up. We discussed it with him again too. He said, I think consolidation of power and fewer options in one industry after another also works against decarbonization and energy efficiency, because it's harder to get supplier buy-in, harder to get cooperation. Anyway, I find that to be an interesting thread. I wonder if the listeners would be interested in more discussion on that topic.
Yeah, I think we're in the first at bat of the first inning of the game in terms of deglobalization. And with that also becomes new sources of supply and reducing our reliance on what we have created, monopolies, to make things easier.
Yeah.
And so I think it's definitely something to be explored. All right. Well, with that said, let's wrap up today. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll be back again with the next episode of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement with those CPO interviews that we alluded to. So until next time, have a good rest of your week.